The next section talking about identity is going to be gender and sex. So we're going to talk about what we mean by gender and sex, how we identify differences between the two, and the differences within each category. So first of all, we're going to be talking about differences biologically and culturally between gender and sex. We're going to talk about some issues of equality between the sexes or between the genders. And then some non-dominant gender identities, and very briefly about the fluidity of human sexuality and how it doesn't define us as humans or as people. Okay, so gender, just like sex, sexuality, and what we've talked about already as in race, these are artificially constructed, just like any other aspect of culture. Remember, culture is not only what we think, say, and do and feel, but it's also the process by which we make the artificial, like gender, sex, and race, and religion, and things like this, the process by which we make these artificial things feel natural. Okay, so Margaret Mead is a very famous anthropologist. She studied under Franz Boas, and if you'll remember, Boas is the founder of historical particularism, and so Margaret Mead studied under him and started working within the school of personality. Okay, so thinking about what makes a person, okay? And so she was the first to actually distinguish between sex and gender, and this happened in 1935 when she was in Papua New Guinea studying sex roles, which we would now call gender roles. Okay, so this is a quote of hers, obviously, but she's basically saying personality traits and characteristics of males and females, or of masculine and femininity, are as linked to sex as are the clothing and the form of headdress that a society is given to each sex. Okay, so what she's saying is that these personality traits are assigned to genders rather than being a product of a gender, and so she's indicating this cultural construction of genders and of sexuality. Okay, so she's looking at the cultural condition and enculturation to understand sex and gender and masculinity and femininity as opposed to biology. So instead of looking and saying that masculinity and femininity are biologically defined, she's instead focusing on cultural conditions and the process of enculturation and how that begins to define male and female, or masculine and feminine. Okay, and so what she's really identified is a difference between sex and gender. Okay, sex being the reproductive forms and functions of the body. So this is biological. Your sex is biological. It's what you're born with. It's your physical parts that you have, the reproductive parts of your body, and the way your body functions. Gender, on the other hand, is cultural. So gender is the cultural expectation of how males and females should behave. Okay, so this goes back to our expectations, norms, and values, and gender is a product of those rather than a product of biology. So when we're talking about sex and gender, or when you're talking about sex and gender in your daily life, because we all know it is in the public discourse right now very heavily, remember to recognize the difference between sex and gender, between biology and culture. Okay. So in American culture, different sexes produce differences in attitudes, temperament, ability. So we have these ideas that different attitudes, behaviors, abilities are ascribed or because of different sexes. So men are athletic, women are not. Women are moody, while men are more stable. These are our kind of ideals that we connect to sex and to sex, right? So we're saying that these produce different attitudes. This can seem to be reinforced through scientific study. So we see studies that suggest boys like to roughhouse while girls like to play house. Boys are wrestling while girls prefer playing with dolls, and things like this. But what's really important to remember is that enculturation starts the minute we're born. So you come out of the womb and immediately we begin speaking to you differently. There are very interesting studies where they've taken a baby and dressed it in pink clothing given it to a group of volunteers to look after, let's say. The volunteers then begin speaking to the baby very softly, saying how beautiful she is, using very quiet voice, different body language, and things like that. So then the researcher says, okay, mom's back for this baby, but could you watch this one? Takes the baby, returns the exact same baby wearing blue clothing. The volunteers treat the exact same human baby differently because now they perceive the baby to be male. So the baby is now handsome and strong, and they talk to it like this, and they use different body language, and it's a very different behavior towards the what they perceive as a male baby versus a female baby, when in fact it's the exact same baby. Okay, so we're teaching boys and girls different things immediately. And while the baby doesn't remember that, it's just indicative of how we differentiate between the sexes and the way we treat different sexes. So when we start to see different behaviors producing or coming out of males and females, it's easy to say, well, that must be biology, that's only a 3-year-old, or that's only a 2-year-old, when in fact that individual has had 2 or 3 years of enculturation or experience being taught the appropriate way to be male or female. Okay, so it's important to remember that this process begins very, very quickly. Okay, and so when we start to get into talking about gender identity as opposed to sex identity, gender identity, remember the cultural expectation of what it means to be male or female, this blurs that clear line about sex and identity of saying that if you have a penis, you behave a certain way. If you have a vagina, you behave another way. So gender identity blurs this line that we like to create of these distinct categories. So culture influences how we identify gender, but also influences our gender. So it works both ways. Okay, and the distinction that Margaret Mead made is kind of breaking down a little bit because it is very difficult to tell where biology ends and culture begins in terms of influencing gender and gender identity or gender roles. Okay, so we are biocultural is the term. We're influenced by both. So it can be difficult to break down the point in time or the age or the behaviors that are influenced by biology and what's influenced by culture. But it's still a valid distinction and an important distinction nonetheless.